So Jesus and the Shema. Now we looked at Shema a little bit in the tradition and from this perspective of Torah. Now let's look at the actual gospel narrative here. So Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through 31. This is an interesting narrative where Jesus is being asked a question and he answers those questions. So there's a little bit of a back and forth interaction. It says, one of the scribes came and heard them arguing, and recognizing that he had answered them well, asked him, what commandment is the foremost of all? Jesus answered, the foremost is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So that's not the end of the story, but I'm going to stop here just for a second. So first of all, what I want you to see is what happens is that this is a conversation between Jesus and one of the scribes. And so the question that he asked is, what is the most important commandment? And Jesus answers. What does he answer with? Well, the quotation from Deuteronomy. He says, hear, O Israel, Lord our God, he's one. And so that's Deuteronomy 6:4. And then he moves on, you shall love the Lord your God, Deuteronomy 6:5. And it's just interestingly that he expands that statement a little bit more in the Gospel. So love the Lord your God with all your heart. Remember, we looked at the features of Deuteronomy 6:5. So there's heart, soul, then your mind, okay, and strength. If you remember, the original Deuteronomy 6:5 did not have mind. That's a new addition here. Well, why is Jesus all of a sudden adding this mind? Or Mark, if you want to think that Mark decided to volunteer the statement and put it into Jesus's quotes, however you wish to think about this, what I want you to realize is absolutely appropriate. It's because the concept of mind is really not fully a concept of ancient Hebrew thought. In Hebrew type of understanding, in the Semitic thinking and in the Eastern thinking, the heart is where you think. I know that might be strange for a Westerner to hear, but the heart is where you think. The heart is where all decisions are made. The heart is the seat of all your cognitive ability. In the heart is where you decide what's true and what's not. That's where you discern things. Heart, essentially, for ancient Israelites, represents what mind or brain represents for the Westerners. So, essentially, for Hellenistic culture, mind would be more recognized, and so heart does not quite convey the same idea, because that's very, very Semitic. And so what you see is a slight expansion or a little bit of a commentary on that quote. So you have words in Greek kind of trying to adapt just a little bit to the Greek style of thinking here. And although this is a quote from Deuteronomy, it also is just a little bit of an expansion statement. So anyway, that's what happens. And of course, that's where people have to, have that clarity. And unless you're accustomed to realizing that you think with your heart, then that insertion of the mind really clarifies it for you. And then, after the statement, after quoting Deuteronomy 6:5, Jesus adds on another statement, and that's, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which is another quote from the Torah. And then he says, these are the greatest ones. So that's just a little bit of a summary of what we saw. But what I want you to realize is the pretext to this whole entire answer is that Yeshua had an exchange of words with some Sadducees. And if you read this in context, the Sadducees talked to him about afterlife. They talked to him about resurrection. They asked him some kind of difficult to answer question, seeking to trip him up, seeking to catch him in his own logic, sort of say. And so they paint this scenario and they ask him a question that they think is difficult to answer. And Jesus gives them a very good answer. And so a scribe who overheard them arguing, who overheard them speaking to each other, he overheard the question and the answer, just kind of being curious. He was really, impressed. And so he decided to ask Jesus a question of his own after he heard what Jesus said. Because he was impressed, he decided to ask him a question. And the question had to do with the priority of commandments. And, which commandment should be the preeminent? That's essentially what he's asking. What a strange question. Aren't all of God's commandments important? So why are you asking about the most important one? Now, to someone it may seem as a strange question, but it really isn't, because essentially you have to understand what he is getting to. There is a purpose behind his question, and the purpose is, again, very cultural. That's something that was going on in the culture of that day, in the culture of that moment. And so there were some Jews in that day, the wise teachers of Torah, who sought to basically succinctly summarize the Torah. That's what they were trying to do. And that is what the scribe was asking Jesus about. What he's asking is, which words summarize the core of the Torah teaching in your opinion? Which commandment is the most important is another word of saying, what statements in the Torah express the heart of it. And so what does Jesus do? He quoted the first line of the Shema, which of course everybody knows, Hear, O Israel, and then he says, love God. So there's that, direction statement. And then he adds another passage from the Torah, and that's Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor. That may be a little bit less known statement, but still very much known. So that is, and that is not a part of the Shema per se, but it certainly is a, part of the Torah that people know well. So, where that fits into the second section of the Torah, where all the commandments, really are, the long, long list of all the types of commandments there are. So remember, first 11 chapters is kind of that foundational preamble, the recounting of the past, and then that call to faithfulness, and then come all these numerous commandments. And so the love your neighbor is in those commandments. That's where that statement is buried. So essentially, it's in the book of Leviticus where it's expressed specifically, but it is implied. That statement is implied in all the other commandments that are in there. When he goes through all the 10 commandments, that's where that love your neighbor commandment really comes out of. It is a part of 10 commandments. It's just not worded or phrased in that exact language. So as far as summarizing the essence of Torah, is one of the most famous summaries from Jewish literature is the story of Hillel and Shema and the pagan who wanted to become a Jew. So it's a famous story. This person comes, he wants to convert, and so his condition, however, is that he must be able to learn the whole teaching of the Torah while standing on one foot. So that certainly is, may seem ridiculous to somebody, but that is exactly what he wants. He says, I'll convert, I'll become a Jew if you teach me the whole Torah while I'm standing on one foot. Kind of a bold statement, but that's his condition. So the story goes that Shammai cast him off. He basically told him, go away. But Hillel, the legend says in the Talmud that Hillel converted him. He actually helped him by saying, and so he summarized the Torah in one statement. He says, whatever is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, and the rest is commentary. Go and study it. So that's a passage from the Talmud from Shabbat 31b. So essentially, it's just retelling us this scenario, this narrative about Hillel and Shammai who are, in this position to summarize the Torah. And so Shammai says, no way, the Torah cannot really be summarized. How crazy you are to think that you can stand on one foot and I'm going to tell you the whole Torah. Well, we're basically Hillel. He says, you know what? I'm going to do this. And so he finds the most central statement in the Torah, and to him is whatever is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That's the whole law. That is the entire Torah, and the rest is just commentary. So now go and study the commentary. So that is how the legend says that Hillel answered him, which of course is a very gracious and wise answer, but in the end, this is a summary statement of how one particular, teacher of the Torah saw the very essence of it. Now, what can be more foundational than the golden rule? You recognize that what we're talking about here is essentially what people call the golden rule culturally. It's hard to argue that, as the core of Torah's teaching, is really at the core is how people are relating to other people. Love your neighbors yourself, or, do not do to others, what you don't want done to you. However you phrase that, you are talking about the golden rule, and that's that second part of the Ten Commandments. What you have to realize is that second part of the Ten Commandments really essentially says that. That's a summary. So Rabbi Akiva, by the way, who lived near the end of the 1st century CE, he summarized the Torah, and this is how he summarized it in a way that's very similar to Jesus. And he said, love your neighbor as yourself. This is the greatest principle of the Torah. These are the words that we have recorded by Rabbi Akiva, who is a notable rabbi. He lived towards the end of the 1st century CE and into the beginning of the 2nd century. And so, curiously enough, that is how he also summarized the Torah. And so Rabbi Akiva was a disciple of Hillel. He was a follower of Hillel. He was from his school of thought. Not a direct disciple per se, but disciple of a disciple, let's put it that way. He was a follower in that direction. So it shouldn't be surprising to you that that is how he articulates the essence of the Torah. Now, getting back to this statement is, Leviticus 19, and Leviticus 18 and 19 contain all these teachings about various laws. And so if you were to read that section of the Torah, that's what you'll find. But in essence, they're all connected to the infamous Ten Commandments. If you were to be careful and look at Leviticus 18 and 19, in some way, shape, or form, they're connected to the Big Ten. So when Yeshua says, "Ve'achavta l'reacha kamocha," you shall love your neighbor as yourself. When he says that phrase in Hebrew, I would imagine he probably spoke Hebrew at that moment because everybody had that memorized by heart. If you're going to quote the Bible, might as well quote it in Hebrew, since everybody understands it. When he says that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, what he's really quoting is the Ten Commandments, or the second part of the Ten Commandments. So that's what he's implying. That's the implication of that statement. And so the Ten Commandments, according to the tradition, were given on 2 tablets of stone. That's what people believe. And so the first tablet describes our orientation towards God, and the second tablet is our relationship with people. So that's kind of that's kind of the traditional thinking that people have. And I realize that there's other traditions about, Ten Commandments being inscribed on some particular stone or some particular type of gemstone. And so, yes, there's a bit of that teaching, but I really don't know much more about that, and I'm not quite sure how ancient that teaching really is. And so it's usually taught that the first 4 commandments speak about our relationship with God, and then 6 are, how we interact with others. And by the way, Jewish tradition teaches this as well. We have a teaching, the only one that I'm familiar with is from Middle Ages. There's a book called Sefer HaChinuch that basically expresses that same idea, that first 4 commandments are about our relationship with God, and 6 are about our interaction with other people. But what I'm wondering, and this is just my personal wondering, is honor your mother and your father. That would be the 5th commandment. Is it strictly about human relationships? That's what I wonder. What if that statement relates to God as well? Now, your father and your mother makes sense. We are talking about human relationships. But, the obedience to that commandment, is the only commandment in the list of the 10 that actually has a promise of long life in the land. Again, remember, this is It's a very Deuteronomy-like promise, right? Long life in a land. And so to me, it's kind of peculiar because you go through the list of all the commandments, and all of a sudden, there's a commandment with a promise attached to it, and that's the only one.